What's up guys, Boss here, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the final balance changes. So these are going to be the balance changes that are going to be coming to the game in a few days. I wanted to make a video on the final version so we know there's no changes, because a few days ago there were the work in progress balances, which is why on these balances here you see some things that are a little bit different. As you can see, the Knight and the Tornado one isn't even going to end up going through. They decided to scratch the Tornado balance, and there's a good reason why, and I'll get into that as I'm discussing the balances. So basically I'm going to be reading you guys, going one by one, reading you guys what the balances are, and I'm going to be giving my opinion on if it's a good balance or not. I will say overall though, I really like these balance changes. That's one of the main reasons why I'm making a video on this, because I usually do not make videos on balances before they're actually live in game, but I thought this one was very interesting. I like them, and that's why I'm doing a video on it. And if you guys like this, I'll do this every single time before they're live in the game, just kind of giving my opinion. Alright, so let's get right into it. So starting off here, we got the Monk. So as you guys can see, the buff it's receiving is the hit time. It's going to go from 0.9 seconds to 0.8. So it's getting a DPS buff, essentially. It's going to hit more often. I think this buff is especially going to be noticeable against tanks, so things like Giant, Electro Giant, Golem, because it's going to hit more often, and as a result, it's going to have that knockback effect more often because it's going to be hitting more often, meaning it's going to get that occasionally more, so you're going to have pushback against troops on that third attack more frequently, which is going to help you defend against big tanks especially. I think this buff is justified, but in my opinion, I actually don't know if the Monk needed a buff. I think the reason why people maybe think it's weak is because it's the worst champion, but keep in mind you can only have one champion in your deck, so I think it's more so the fact that all the other champions are better, and it's not that Monk is weak, because let's say the Monk was a legendary card, right? I mean, it obviously wouldn't be because it had that ability, but let's just pretend you could use another champion and Monk in the same deck. I personally think Monk would be used a ton if that were the case, and this is always what's going to happen. The worst champion is always going to be, you know, just not used as much compared to the others, just due to the fact that champions have that unique ability that you can only have one in each deck. So I think every balance that from here on out, we're going to see this often happen, where the worst champion gets a buff when it might not necessarily, it might not be a weak card, but it's just the worst champion. And it's understandable that Supercell wants all the champions to be really strong because they want people to obviously spend money maxing them out. I mean, that's obvious, right? And it is a good, I think, business tactic, and, you know, it's understandable. Alright, so next one is the Firecracker. It's getting a massive buff. I mean, this is probably the biggest buff for sure out of all of them. First hit time, 1 second, all the way to 0.6. I don't think people realize how big of a buff this is, especially against multiple units and swarms and stuff like that, especially if the Firecracker doesn't get stuck anymore. I think it is going to go from right now being one of the worst cards in the game to potentially one of the best. And as you guys know, Firecracker is a pretty versatile card when it's good. You could use it in Hog, you could use it in Royal Hogs, you could use it in RG, you could use it in, there's a couple other things you could use it in, I guess, like minor control decks, stuff like that. Overall, I think it's just, and in some like giant skeleton decks, there's probably a couple other things I'm forgetting, but point I'm making is it's a support card you can play in a lot of different things. So if it becomes strong after the buff, I imagine it's going to be everywhere. So I guess that's the main thing I want to say about that. We have to kind of see what effect it has, but my prediction is it could become one of the best cards in the game. And I think it's kind of a deserved buff, but they might have overdone it. I think maybe they could have done 0.8 instead of 0.6, because 40%, that's a big buff. So next up, we got the Archers. As you can see, again, another big buff. Not as much as the Firecracker, but it's still a really big buff. And keep in mind, it's not even their first attack, it's their overall hit time. So it's going from 1.1 to 0.9. I think they might have overdone this. I think maybe they could have done 1.1 to 1 second. And again, for all these balances, feel free to let me know in the comments what you guys think about each one. What do you guys agree on me with? What do you guys disagree with me with? And what balances that are implemented would you have changed? Because I think they over buffed the Firecracker and Archers a little bit, in my opinion, but let me know if you guys think it was a good buff, because I think 1.1 to 1 would have been better, because 18% faster, that's a big buff. I mean, DPS, you can see 22% increase, and we're already seeing the Archers occasionally used more anyway after that buff they had I believe a few months back. It was a similar buff to this, I think, but it was probably a little different. And we're seeing them used in this Mortar deck, Mortar Archer's Flying Machine that's used. So besides just 3.0, we're occasionally seeing them, and also Mortar Cycle, so not the one without Flying Machine, but that one with Knight and Rocket. So they're in a couple other decks besides Expo, but we'll see how it plays out. I think they could have maybe overdone the buff a little bit. Okay, so the Knight one, as you guys can see, they changed it from 6% to 3%. I really like that because I think a 6% health buff is a little bit too much, especially since it's kind of debatable on whether the Knight even needed a buff in the first place, because I consider the Knight to be a pretty average card right now. I don't really see why it got a buff. I honestly, of all the buffs, this is probably the one I disagree with the most, because I for sure think the Knight is better than the Firecracker and the Archers. I mean, we see the Knight all the time now in Expo. We see it played in Mortar. You could even use it in, Graveyard. I guess the idea behind it is the Valk is slightly stronger than it, but I don't really know if it needed this buff, but let me know how you guys feel. I mean, it's a small buff, 3%, right? I'm glad it's not 6%, because I think that would have been overkill. But with that being said, Knight isn't a threatening card. Like, no one, when they lose a game, they're like, oh, I lost because of the Knight, right? So it's not really one of those types of cards that, like, even if it's a little too strong, it's not one that people, I think, are going to complain about too much. So I guess it's fine. So this, probably of all the buffs is my favorite. If you guys didn't know, I like to run Sparky. It's one of my favorite archetypes to run. And Goblin Giant was awful for a very, very long time. It still is right now. I guess that's the point I'm making. For the last few months, even like almost a year, it is, for sure the last 6 months or so, it's been the worst win condition in the game. We're probably on par with Elixir Golem, but I don't know, Elixir Golem is kind of toxic, so I don't think people want it necessarily to be too viable, but Goblin Giant kind of has a unique mechanic to it with the Spear Goblins, and as you can see, those are getting a buff. I personally think the Goblin Giant itself could have gotten a buff, or maybe they could have added a third Spear Goblin. That was my idea, but this will help it a little bit. It's a little weird, though, that when they're in the backpack, they have, like, a faster, like, attack speed or hit time, but I think this is a completely deserved buff. I think not many people would disagree with this buff because, like, everyone knows the Goblin Giant is pretty horrible. There's no reason to use it. Even in Sparky, there's pretty much no reason to run it over the Giant. Most people run Giant with Sparky nowadays, and even with this buff, I feel like it's probably not going to be that good. They might have to give it an additional buff in a few months. That's my prediction anyway. Alright, now we get into the nerfs. This is one of the most controversial nerfs. As you can see, Rocket is getting a tower damage nerf. So I'm kind of a little neutral, or like on the fence with this one on whether it needed one. But again, keep in mind, this is coming from someone who doesn't run Rocket a ton. I use it occasionally, of course, but I would say in most of my decks, I'm not running the Rocket too much, so you can tell, maybe I'll be a tiny bit biased when I say I don't mind it getting a nerf, but I will say, though, there are a lot of people who think Rocket should have been nerfed, and it's mostly the people running Rocket who are defending it, saying it didn't need one, but I do agree with all the people saying, like, there's nothing more frustrating than just getting Rocket cycled, because there's many people who use Logbait Rocket or Expo Rocket, and they don't get damage from anything else, and the only damage they get is from the Rocket, and I don't really think it makes sense to lose a game from just Rocket damage. I think that is kind of boring, and I think that's the reasoning behind the nerf, but was it a little bit too much? Possibly. Maybe they could have done 30 to 27.5, so they could have done half instead of 5%. But again, this is one where you guys are really going to have to let me know what you think, because on Twitter, I can tell you it was very, very controversial, but most people defending the Rocket are people who use it, and I think majority of people who don't use the Rocket were overall happy to see this nerf, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it has gotten a little bit out of hand recently, I would say, the Rocket cycle, especially with the implementation of champions, because especially with the Mighty Miner, a lot of people pair that with the Rocket, and you get that, or the Archer Queen, and you get that 3-card cycle, and I think that's really where it became even stronger than it already was. The fact that in Triple Elixir, if you had a champion down, you could just get 3 Rockets down quite easily and still defend. So the Phoenix nerf, as you can see, definitely deserved in my opinion. Even after that nerf it's gotten several nerfs. It was one of the most broken cards of all time on release, because you can tell after all these nerfs, it's still so strong. So it's only losing 20% of its health, the reborn Phoenix, and then it's also losing 20% of its damage. So I kind of like this, and honestly, before they did all these nerfs, I was actually one of the people who said the best way to nerf the Phoenix before all the nerfs. So now this is good, and this would be too much, my idea. But before all the nerfs, my idea originally was the first nerf it should have gotten, the Reborn Phoenix should have had half the health and half the damage of the original Phoenix, and that would have ended up being pretty good, I feel like. Now it would be too much because of all the other things it got. I think it got minus 10% health and stuff like that. But this is good. I feel like it's finally now going to be, it's going to be a little strong, I think, still, because there are many times where the Phoenix egg doesn't even hatch. But it's still a small nerf, right? And I feel like the card isn't too broken right now. So that's good. I really like that balance. I think it's a good one. Okay, again, this one even may be more controversial than the rocket nerf, log. As you can see, the pushback going from 1 to 0.7. Now, a lot of you guys might not like what I have to say. Well, before I talk about the log, the tornado one that you can see is kind of blurred, not happening. They scratched it, and before I get into log, I should have actually talked about that. So the tornado, the reason why they took that away is because me and some other pros actually said on Twitter, I think this is the reason why they decided to change that, because again, work in progress balance changes, they tweeted out on Twitter, get feedback, and then adjust it accordingly. So the reason why, as you can see, they were originally going to do minus 6% damage, so it takes 2 ticks to kill skeletons. The reason why that wouldn't work is because of the king activation. It would be really easy to activate the king tower against graveyard. You wouldn't be able to do it every time, but there would probably be like a 50-50 chance, and that's not a very high risk for getting a king activation against a graveyard, which is going to basically win you the game. Because when you get the king tower activated versus graveyard, the defense is just so easy. You can be so aggressive, so it wouldn't work out. My idea, let me know what you guys think. I think the tornado should just do half the damage it does to towers. That was actually my reply on Twitter. That would be, I think, a really good nerf. So that way people can't get chip damage with the NATO when they're using it on offense. I mean, it's a very small thing because that's not the main reason people use the tornado, but it would still be a small nerf. I think that would be a very, very good nerf to the tornado. Right now, I forget how much damage it does to towers. I think at max level, it does like 70 damage to towers. So what if they cut that in half and it only does like 35 damage to towers, or 30 or something? But the reason why it needs to do a little bit of damage, my idea originally was it does 0 to towers, but it can't be that, because if it is, then people can tornado anywhere on the other side of the map, even on the king tower, without having to worry about the king tower activation. That wouldn't work. So it needs to do at least 1 damage to towers to avoid that, but I think they could cut it in half, the damage it does to towers, and that would be a nice little nerf to it. Okay, now we get in the log, now that I got that out of the way. Some of you guys might hate me for saying this, because I know there's so many people who use the log, and this is one of the main reasons why it definitely deserved a nerf, in my opinion, how used it is compared to the other small spells. I think this nerf is 100% deserved. You know, I know I'm going to get a lot of people disagreeing with me, but, like, let me explain why. It, for the last few years, has by far been the best small spell in the game. They nerfed the damage it did to towers a little bit. That hardly did anything. It is so much better than Snowball, so much better than Zap, better than Bar Barrel. Right now, it might be close to the strength of Bar Barrel after this nerf it's getting. But guys, trust me when I say this nerf is hardly going to affect the log. It is just going to be such a small, like, subtle nerf, in my opinion. 30% pushback, I mean, everyone's still going to be running it in cycle decks. It's not even going to make a massive difference. It just makes it a little less defensive, in my opinion, which I think is completely fair. It has just been way, way too used for the longest time. And people who defend the log, they all run it, and they're just running it, and they just don't want it to get nerfed. But, like, if we're being honest here, it definitely deserves a nerf. I mean, the stats, like, of the usage rate, and just the fact that it's so much better than every other small spell, it literally, there's no reason that it didn't deserve a nerf. But I know it's such a loved card, and that's why people didn't want it to get one, but that shouldn't prevent it from getting a nerf just because it's popular and used a lot. It is too strong. I think that's just, I mean, that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. And lastly, we got the Archer Queen. First hit time, so the first attack that the Archer Queen does is going to be a lot slower. This is a pretty substantial nerf. I know a lot of people are saying that this is small, But let me tell you the biggest difference this is going to make. First time hit, right? So every time it targets a new card, so say she's attacking like a minion horde or a skeleton army, each individual one of those, it's taking her much longer to fire the first shot. This means she's going to be significantly worse against swarm cards. So things like bats, skeleton army, minion horde, things like that. So against beatdown, where the cards have a lot of health, so against things like Valkyrie, Golem, E-Giant, stuff like that, she's not going to be that much worse against. But against swarms, you're going to notice a massive difference. So there's definitely going to be some matchups where she's going to be noticeably worse in. But at the same time, I still think she's going to be an amazing card. Potentially even still the best champion. It's hard to say. I think most people consider her to be the best champion. I know there's some people have like bias and stuff and say like Golden Knight or Mighty Miner, Skeleton King, but I think she's the best champion. But with the Monk buff as well, and keep in mind Monk is good against the Archer Queen, the Monk kind of technically counters the Archer Queen with the ability, it pretty much kills her. So I would say with that, we're going to for sure notice a difference with the Archer Queen being used. She won't be as strong, but of course she'll still be very good just because she's a champion, and she might even still be better than the Golden Knight and the Mighty Miner a little bit. Hard to say, but either way, these are the balances, my opinion on all of them. I overall very much like these balances. I think all of these on here, there's not really one where I disagree with, and I'm like, I don't think this should be included. I really like this, especially the log one. I'm so glad they finally went through with the log nerf, even though they knew there would be some pushback from the community, because I just think it deserved one. As someone who's played this game for now over 6 years, like, I can tell you right now that the log has just always been so broken, and it's gotten so many nerfs over the years, and it's like after all of them, it's still so good. That's what I'm telling you guys, not to worry too much. After this nerf log gets, I'm telling, and I mean this when I say this, it is still going to be so good, so don't even worry that much. It's like, it's still going to be completely viable in your deck, and if anything, it's going to still be on the stronger end by a decent amount. So let me know what you guys think we're missing from the balances. I mean, personally, there were some other cards like I'm going to throw out here right now from what people especially have said on Twitter and like pros and stuff, and just overall people saying like Graveyard probably maybe needed a nerf, like something in the deck, or RG. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys think RG needed a nerf? Graveyard needed one? I think a small RG nerf personally would be kind of justified, and same with the Graveyard. Maybe they could have taken away like one skeleton or something like that again, because both of them have been very strong recently. But yeah, RG, I don't know what would exactly get a nerf. Maybe like a small hit points nerf of like 3% or something like that, or a very small damage nerf, but I don't know. I guess they thought RG was fine. I think after these balances, especially RG is going to be very good because RG pairs well with the Monk. So curious to see how these balances play out. Let me know, do you guys want these kinds of balance videos again before they actually go live in the game? Just me kind of giving my opinion on them in this type of format. I guess if this video gets a lot of support, I'll take it as I should do it again. So kind of see what happens. This is going to be like a trial because I don't think I've ever done this before where I just discussed the balances before they were actually live. But obviously when they're live, that's when I make videos on the balances and the decks. So see what happens. Anyway, make sure to like the video if you guys did end up enjoying it. Subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. And thanks again. Until next time, guys.